Hey, what's up, everyone? Another episode of another hot mic. I'm your host, Hasani. Episode number 2, we're going to get into today. And we're going to deal with now that baseball season is here, the new numbers actually say it's less than 6% of African Americans who's playing in the league. Now, I have to do a confession because, like everyone else, I pretty much drank the Kool-Aid when we start talking about why that percentage is so low. And one thing I always try to do here at another hot mic is when I'm wrong, I like to say I'm wrong and I like to tell you why I'm wrong. When we start talking about the lowest percentage in Major League Baseball, the official number is 6.7% as of the opening day roster were African American players. Now, I know when we start comparing other generations as far as decades, with the pinnacle being in the 80s and the 1990s, where we had double digits high between 16 and 19% of all Major League Baseball players were African American. It was a heroic thing because I grew up in that time. And many of my heroes that played during those eras, like Ken Griffey Jr. and Barry Bonds and so many other black players, we saw ourselves. So it was easy for us that when we turned on the baseball game, we didn't have to look very far to see people that we wanted to emulate. And if you were like me who did play baseball and who was very talented, you may have had aspirations of one day being like your hero. Mine was Ken Griffey Jr. And I played the position of center field because of him. I actually was a pitcher when I started out, and even in high school, I was throwing in the mid 90 miles per hour on my fastball. I had a great changeup, but it was just something about the excitement of watching Ken Griffey Jr. jump over that wall to make a catch. He was a left-handed batter. His swing was immaculate. It was just something beautiful, and it inspired me to want to be like Ken Griffey Jr. So the reason why I'm telling you that is that I'm telling you that I have an investment in baseball. I like baseball. I don't love it as much as other sports, but I like it because I understand there's a certain level of skill, especially when it comes to hitting. And I'll talk about that later, how that affects our percentage of African Americans in the game. But overall, it's a beautiful game, and it's been around for over 150 years. So that in itself make it special when we start talking about being unique to America and being unique to American culture. Now, what was that Kool-Aid I was talking about? So on another hot mic, the one thing we never want to do is pretty much agree with something just for the sake of being different. That's why we're a hot mic. So when I say I was wrong, I immediately thought that it was a level of systematic racism that was involved in why black players aren't playing. I work with kids every day when we start talking about youth sports. And I can look at my community, and I'm here in Las Vegas. We have a big baseball population. We have a lot of fields. But when you look at it from the surface, a lot of those fields aren't in the inner city. So it was very easy for me to think, well, it has to be because they don't build baseball fields in the inner city, so blacks have nowhere to go. And that might be true logistically. And when we start talking about availability of the space needed to play baseball, but in the end, it's not necessarily the access to the field, it's the access to the equipment. It's the access to the time investment that is required to develop a good baseball swing, to develop a great pitcher. It's not something that you can just wake up and say, hey, I feel good, I'm strong, I'm 6'4", I have this athletic ability. Just like golf or tennis, anything that where the perfection and the consistency of how you move and the consistency of how you swing your bat, the consistency of how your weight moves as you're going through your swing, the timing of the ball, understanding the different pitches that are out there and how to counteract those with the position of your body, how you swing your bat, your timing. Those are things that take years, years of development. So then that way it becomes something that you don't have to think about. You just react. And those are the things that affect African American communities, is the time. So yes, are there a few baseball diamonds here in Las Vegas in the inner city? Absolutely. But are there the coaches that come into the inner city to allow these younger players to have the time investment, the day after day after day, they can work and enhance their craft? And that simply doesn't exist. Because here in Las Vegas, there's so many organizations that you have to pay in order to play. When I was coming up, the rec leagues, your local community had public leagues to where all you had to do is show up. If your parents had the money, you could buy cleats to make yourself look exceptional or feel like you were exceptional. But in the end, you just had to show up, and there were always volunteers. There were always plenty of adults that wanted to have kids grow up in the sport, to be a part of the sport. And at that time, you felt as though you had a chance. But that simply doesn't exist anymore. Some of these leagues, just to go to a summer baseball camp where you may go for 3 days just to learn how to hit and get maybe a high level view of how to hit, because you can't learn how to hit in 3 days. Some of those are upwards of $3,000. That's $1,000 per day. And at that particular point, who can afford, in many situations, to have your kid being invested in something that takes a longer time to pay off, even before you see any results of your training, let alone have a year that allows a player to have a full year of playing this team, playing that team, playing that team. So many of these leagues now travel from state to state just to find a game. Who has that kind of money in there in the city? So when you look at it from a high level view, you can see that there are some consistent gaps that affect all of society as far as socioeconomic levels, as far as access to funds, access to substantial coaching. But we can't use that as an excuse. And that's the Kool-Aid. Because we would say, oh, it's all about money, and that the league in baseball hasn't done anything to bridge that gap because it's all about money. But in the end, if there is a lack of demand and there is a lack of organization to where people make sure that these free programs that I grew up with are available, it's not racism, guys. It's economics. And if you don't have a community that sees that need to have their youth invested into things that, yes, you have to contribute if you want it to be available. And that's the problem. Because now, unfortunately, in so many of our communities, we feel as though it should be provided. We don't think we have to contribute. So we feel this entitlement to say, well, the city of Las Vegas is responsible for having activities for my child. And then the argument would be, oh, I pay taxes, so there should be programs for my child. But we never stop to think, why don't we create programs for our children? Why don't we say to ourselves that we have to provide these opportunities? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it doesn't occur. There's no such thing as always. There's no such thing as never. There are always exceptions, and there's always examples that we can point out and say to ourselves, see, this does exist. I'm not knocking that. I know that exists. But what I'm talking about, the consistent level of across the nation, because remember, baseball is supposed to be America's pastime. But has it passed its time? Has it not reached out to make sure that it allows everyone from any socioeconomic opportunity to participate in baseball? And for a long time, I think they were right in identifying it's not their responsibility, because in essence, it isn't. It's the parents' responsibility. to make sure that their kids have opportunities that they want their children to have exposure to. Now, when I say this, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a progressive, and I'm definitely not far right, and I'm definitely not MAGA. I'm an independent. And the reason why I mentioned that is that because when you're listening to these broadcasts with another hot mic, there's no skin we have in the game. I don't have a sponsor of Major League Baseball that's asking me to promote baseball, and nor do I have a sponsor that's telling me to be against something for the sake of lobbyism or creating a controversy. At another hot mic, I would like to think that we're shining an additional light on those things that people like me, you drink the Kool-Aid and you only look from a high level. So let's transition, right? So we talked about how it's the parents' responsibility, lack of access, lack of quality coaches, too much money in order to develop these skills. But just the sheer number of people who actually make it into the league is equivalent to making it into the NBA. And when you think about that, people would say, oh, okay, well, there should be more blacks. Well, the key is, and here's the difference. For a black athlete, getting into the NBA, he can do that at 19. And if he's talented enough, like Kobe or Kevin Garnett or Moses Malone, who all went from high school into the NBA and did fairly well. So those are success stories. But there are also some failure stories as well of people who thought they could make it, left school early, were the greatest on the college team. But then when they got to the NBA, they just didn't have the technique and the skills and the dedication to further get enhanced and become better in order to stay in the NBA. So in baseball, that's even worse. Because yes, you can get signed out of high school at 19, but then they're not projecting you to go right to the majors where people think that, oh my God, now I get an opportunity to have big money contracts. No, the reality is that the average player spends 4 to 7 years in the minor. So now you're 26 and you may have come up to the minors if you have that kind of talent, maybe once or twice or have some stints. But they also have different things as far as your service date. Meaning like when you came to the Major League Baseball and for how long you were there, it affects your ability to get your next contract. So the players that they're hoping will turn into something of value, they're holding on to those service dates. They'll bring them up and then make sure they don't get that eligibility because they don't want to pay them too soon. It's not like that in the NBA. And it's not like that in the NFL. If you're good enough, even though you're on that rookie deal, which lasts about 3 to 5 years, if you're great enough and you outplay your contract, guess what you do? You can hold out and then force your team to pay you what you feel as though you're worth. It's not like that in Major League Baseball. You simply cannot say, I'm outperforming my contract. They totally control your access to the majors, and they control your access to the big money. You're seeing players like Vladimir Guerrero is the second generation, probably Hall of Famer, who once again fell into those same things. His service contract delayed his money. So if you're in the African American community and you have this athlete who's talented to where he could go either in the NFL or he can go into the NBA or MLB, why would you waste 4 to 7 years of your life playing for $27,000, $39,000, $45,000 if you're lucky and you get a great signing bonus because the expectation for you is to be elite? You may get a couple million. But during that duration of you developing, that duration of you spending all those times in the minors season after season, day after day, to little or no fanfare. Sometimes you'll go to a stadium and there may not even be anyone there. But you still have to play at that elite level because you're hoping to be seen. And that part of it is a problem. Because in the African American community, where being identified because of years and years of not being seen or not being allowed to shine, that's very critical in the mind of a young child. As I mentioned to you earlier, I wasn't interested in baseball because I wanted to hit home runs. I was interested in baseball because I wanted people to see me accelerate in the center field, jump up on the wall and grab the ball. That's athleticism. That's what the African American strives in and excels in, is the athleticism. The player involvement throughout the course of the game, especially if you're in the outfield, other than backing up an errant throw or positioning yourself in case there's an errant throw, your involvement in the outfield is very minor. There are some times where a left fielder may only catch 2 errant fly balls. The rest of the game, he's in support row in the outfield. Or he's sitting on the bench waiting 2.5 innings to 3 innings for himself to get up to bat, and hopefully he can make an impact on the game. In the NBA, all 10 players that are on the court are making an impact on every play. If you don't do your job in that play, and there's many plays throughout the course of the game, it shows. But if you're elite, your play can impact it, and at that point, you become legendary. It's not like that in baseball. So when we start talking about the evolution of the African American player, we have to really look at it from this perspective. Is that when we say Jackie Robinson broke into the major leagues in 1947, he was doing it more for baseball, more than just baseball. He was doing it because it was creating a idea that black people could contribute to society, and not only just be basic in our contribution because we were already waiters and servers on trains and hotels, but we could be elite, and we could actually leapfrog over our white counterparts. And it gave us hope that with dedication and just given a chance and access, that we could be great or greater. So then we start talking about those generations, Frank Robinson, we start talking about the Reggie Jacksons. We were not hitting or running for stats. We were running for identity. And that's what's missing. Because in baseball, they're not concerned about identity. They're concerned about the paycheck. So that brings me to point number 2. Point number 1 is access, availability, consistency, resources. But point number 2 is, why are we not playing? Because the identity we can get on so many other fronts. There are so many kids nowadays who may be watching this podcast, and I thank you for that, who would spend their time wanting to be a social influencer rather than being a shortstop. That wasn't like that when we grew up. You only had a few avenues that if you wanted to get out the house and you wanted to be expressive of yourself or your talent or believe in yourself or identify the things that you thought could make you great, sports were one of the vehicles to do that. But now in the age of social media, there's so many different things that you can do. Even if you aren't great, you can believe that you're great. So it doesn't necessarily put you in a situation where you go out and you set out to prove those things. So that's another element of it, is that African American players aren't thinking of playing for the next generation in many cases. And I'm not saying that they're not conscious of that, but it's very to no impact of being a great player in the major leagues now. And when you walk into a if you walk into a community of black people, the chances of people even knowing who you are, unless you're like a Mookie Betts, is slim to none. Because we don't play in order to gain identity. We assume that being in the major leagues is our identity. And the element of being great black men in a society in which we're still fighting to be acknowledged as being great and substantial, that focus is lost. So once again, that has nothing to do with racism. That has nothing to do with a entity preventing you from creating an identity. It actually stems from the fact that people don't really see it as being important the way that it used to. So once again, I'll put that caveat and say again, I'm not talking always, all the time, never, anything like that, because there's some players that definitely play. But unfortunately, if I could just throw out statistics and give you an example, from 1947 to 1995, the average batting average for an African American player was 290. And today, the average batting average for an African American player is 270. Now, people will look at that and say, oh, that's 20 percentage points. That's not a big difference. Well, that's because you don't understand baseball. Baseball is one of the few sports in which you can be below average, meaning that Hall of Fame criteria used to be batting 300. That means that you have a successful hit in 3 out of every 10 pitches. The other 7, you're making it out. So when you start talking about the difference between 290 and 270, one puts you 10 percentage points for pretty much was a guaranteed Hall of Fame career. And now 270 in today's game puts you as mediocre. So those percentage points matter. So why am I bringing that element of it up? The reason why I'm saying that is because even though we have African Americans that are less than 7% that are playing in the Major League Baseball, those 7% aren't even our best. When we see them, yes. Are some of them excellent? Yes. But do we have that saturation of talented players to where you could say a group of people maintained a 290 baseball average, daggone near close to Hall of Fame? No. So we're getting African American players who are getting into the major leagues. Yes, they're talented, but they're getting in small roles. They're not getting in dominant roles. They're not hitting in the 3rd or 4th spot. They're not the ones that are coming up or pinch hitting when it's needed to win the game, because they simply don't have that pool of talent that allows us to see the Barry Bonds, the Frank Robinsons, all of the people that you would look for, the Ken Griffey Jr.'s, the Ricky Hendersons, all those people that you would look for that would be on a team that could both run, catch, and hit. We're seeing now, as opposed to multi-dimensional players, we're seeing players that are coming through and are making it, maybe because they just can hit a home run. And that's another problem with baseball. There have only been black people who have played that were sheer power, and we can look at the Negro Leagues as a prime example. If you look at even back in the Negro Leagues in the 50s and 40s, if you looked at like Josh Gibson, you're talking about massive men. You can look at them and tell that given the opportunity to put contact on the baseball had no chance. But when we see our African American players now coming up, you can't necessarily look at them and see a physical dominance. And I'm not saying that genetically we don't produce those players anymore. It's just simply they're not playing baseball. They're playing other sports in which size and girth allows them to get quicker to a paycheck. And that's okay. I don't knock anyone for how they earn a living, but it goes back to my point. Why are we playing? So when you hear all this, it would really sound like I'm saying that, as I said, drinking a Kool-Aid, I'm identifying it's not racism. It's some systematic things that are there, absolutely. But are people intentionally not allowing African Americans to play? No. We don't have the interest because, unfortunately, there's no value that we see. We don't see the longer game of saying to ourselves, we need to create a presence, because once that presence has been eliminated, it's harder to gain that presence back. We don't view that obligation to our generation or the next generation like that. Because if we did, we would simply be playing because we don't want to be absent. And unfortunately, that's not the thinking of today's generation. There's no obligation for the next generation. There's no obligation to be seen. Because, like this podcast, to be seen, you simply can download an app, get an email address, sign up for it, and at that point, you can create and be whatever you want to be. And that is part of the problem. We have to say to ourselves, when is it that we have an obligation to do something simply because being absent in that space makes it harder for someone to get that space back? So when Jackie Robinson took all of the racial discriminations and the death threats in the 50s, 60s, pretty much throughout his whole career, he didn't do that because he was getting paid a lot of money. He did that because he understood that if you want to bring about change, someone has to do it. And then when you get there, you have to make sure that you expand the vehicle enough to be able to allow others to come in and ride with you. I have seen a few camps where it has maybe a African American player as far as baseball camps around the country, and I commend them for that. But sometimes you can have so many smaller things that you don't create the larger things. So I would like to see those players who are doing those things in their own communities on a smaller level organize on a larger level, so then that way we can get sustained growth and not have it be totally dependent upon Major League Baseball or the government or the city. If these former players want the next generation who aren't their kids and born into semi-wealth to allow them to have the resources and the access to baseball to continue it, then they need to be better at organizing with themselves and amongst themselves, so then that way we get sincere and genuine efforts to pass on America's pastime to the next generation of African Americans. So in conclusion, I have to confess I was wrong. I literally thought that once again we had systematic racism that was designed to not allow African Americans to get into Major League Baseball. And it may be some of that, because we have a higher percentage of scouts and people who work in baseball than we do actually playing on the field. So they also have an obligation to go and find these black players or find these organizations to make sure that these people and these children who have that talent can understand what it would take and find ways in which to make sure they can sustain that growth process to allow them to get an opportunity to be in the major leagues. More simply said than done, I'm sure, but it's capable of being done if you want to do it. So when we look at Major League Baseball, and I'll wrap this up, is that you have over 1,600 between major, minor, college baseball, 1,600 teams and agencies and opportunities to where there's minor league baseball team, college baseball team, pro baseball, you even have overseas baseball. So you have more opportunity to find a place in baseball, even if you're not a player, as a scout, a GM, an organizer. So then that way the presence in baseball becomes saturated with the people who want African Americans to play baseball. And that's the other element of it, is the commitment to expanding all of the influence that's around baseball, so that way you can see yourself. I don't think everybody has to be a player. I don't think everybody has to be in the Hall of Fame as a player on the field. I think that being in the Hall of Fame as an announcer or as a broadcaster or as a GM or an executive, possibly an owner in the future, has just as much value as the person hitting and catching and preventing home runs. But do we see it like that? Do we think of it like that? Do we want to believe that it makes a difference? Do we want to say to ourselves that it's important to do? Because if we did, the opportunities are there because it's so vast. It's not like the NBA or the NFL that only has a limited amount of positions, and then you have the G League and you have the UFL and then some random leagues over in Greece and those kind of things. We compete for those small opportunities. When in baseball, there's vast amount of opportunities that gives us the opportunity to show ourselves and be present and to make an impact, but we're not taught to view it that way because the game is just played too long. So once again, I'll wrap this up because, as you know, my goal is never to beat a dead horse. They've worked hard enough and they need to be left dormant. But I would say this in conclusion is that if you're playing for the greatness, that's great. But if you're playing for the presence and the identity and for the acknowledgement that we're still here and we still exist and that we can contribute to America's pastime more than just the popcorn stands and the vending and the pamphlets that we sell at the game, but you really want to show that you care about the next generation and that the next generation should be present in all levels of society, then we have work to do. And that work is not dependent upon Major League Baseball or the government. It's dependent upon those people who lack that identity. And that's the difference between historic Major League Baseball African American players and today's player. They fought for the identity. They hit home runs so that all people could be seen. They didn't hit home runs necessarily for themselves. They hit home runs so that America and America's pastime could represent all of the people that constitute its makeup. And that is another hot mic moment.